The monsoon season in Southeast Asia operates on a rhythm older than any human conflict. From May through October, the southwest winds pull moisture off the Indian Ocean and dump it across Indochina in sheets that turn rivers into torrents and airstrips into lakes of red mud. Then in November, the pattern reverses. The northeast monsoon arrives, drier and cooler, bringing clear skies and good flying weather that lasts through early spring. March sits at the tail end of this window, the last weeks before the heat builds and the storms return. For the pilots of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing stationed at Tan Son Nhut, weather was not an inconvenience. It was operational reality. Every mission north of the DMZ required precise timing, fuel calculations adjusted for headwinds, target selections based on cloud cover forecasts that were often wrong. The North Vietnamese knew this as well as the Americans did. They moved supplies during the monsoons, hid their SAM sites in the clouds, and waited for the moments when the weather turned the sky into an ally. Tan Son Nhut sat 6 miles northwest of Saigon, a sprawling complex of runways and revetments and Quonset huts baking under a sun that pushed temperatures past 90 degrees by mid-morning. The base was home to F-4 Phantoms, F-100 Super Sabres, and A-1 Sky Raiders, a mix of jets and propeller-driven attack aircraft that operated around the clock, launching strikes into Laos, Cambodia, and the southern panhandle of North Vietnam. The flight line smelled of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid and the particular burnt metal odor that clung to aircraft returning from combat. At night, the sound of engines never stopped. Phantoms screamed down the runway on afterburner. Cargo planes rumbled in with supplies. Medevac choppers clattered overhead, red crosses painted on their bellies, carrying the wounded south to the field hospitals. The 8th Tactical Fighter Wing flew interdiction missions, hunting supply convoys along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, striking bridges and fuel depots, providing close air support for ground units in contact. It was dangerous, repetitive work. The North Vietnamese had flooded the trail network with anti-aircraft guns, and the jungle canopy made visual identification nearly impossible. Pilots flew low and fast, skimming the treetops, watching for muzzle flashes and the white smoke trails of surface-to-air missiles. But in the first weeks of March 1967, something changed. It began with the weather forecasts. The meteorological officer attached to the wing, a captain named Donald Marsh, a former commercial pilot who had studied atmospheric science at UCLA, noticed an anomaly in the data coming from reconnaissance flights over Laos. The cloud formations at high altitude, particularly over the Annamite Range along the Lao-Vietnamese border, were behaving inconsistently. Satellite imagery showed dense cloud banks forming rapidly, persisting for hours, then dissipating without the expected rainfall. The formations appeared in areas where terrain and wind patterns should not have produced such structures. Marsh flagged the issue in his briefings, but no one paid much attention. Weather in Southeast Asia was inherently unpredictable. Microclimates formed and collapsed within hours. Thunderheads could build to 50,000 feet in the span of an afternoon. The pilots adjusted their flight plans and moved on. Then on the morning of the 15th, 2 F-4 Phantoms from the 433 Tactical Fighter Squadron failed to return from a strike mission over the Steel Tiger region of southern Laos. The mission had been routine. Call signs Falcon 1 and Falcon 2, a 2-ship element tasked with hitting a suspected supply cache near the town of Chapone. The weather forecast had called for scattered clouds below 10,000 feet, good visibility, light winds. The Phantoms had taken off at 0730 hours, refueled from a KC-135 tanker over Thailand, and proceeded to the target area. Radio contact was normal throughout the ingress. The lead pilot, Major Richard Klein, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, reported visual contact with the target at 0842 hours and began his attack run. At 0847 hours, Klein transmitted a single message. Falcon 1, contact. Something in the clouds. Break right, break right. Then silence. The wingman, Captain Peter Voss, did not respond. No mayday. No emergency transponder. No ejection signals. Both aircraft simply disappeared from radar. A search and rescue operation was launched within the hour. A-1 Sky Raiders flew low over the area, scanning for wreckage, for parachutes, for any sign of the missing crews. They found nothing. No smoke, no debris. The jungle below was unbroken green, dense and impenetrable, covering terrain that had swallowed aircraft before and left no trace. But the Sky Raider pilots reported something else. They said the cloud cover over the target area was unlike anything they had seen. They described it as a solid wall, dark gray and unnaturally smooth, stretching across the ridgeline like a curtain. They said it did not move with the wind, and they said that when they approached it, their radios filled with static so thick they could not transmit. One pilot, a major named Carl Hendricks, who had flown combat missions in Korea and had 15 years of experience, said the clouds looked wrong. He could not explain it better than that. They simply looked wrong. By evening, the search was called off. Major Klein and Captain Voss were listed as missing in action. The wreckage was never found. And that night, in the operations briefing room at Tan Son Nhut, Captain Marsh pulled up the meteorological data from the day and stared at it for a long time. The cloud formation over Chapone had not been in the forecast. It had appeared in less than 6 minutes. The loss of 2 aircraft and 4 crewmen was not unusual. The Air Force had been losing planes over Laos and North Vietnam at a steady rate since the beginning of Rolling Thunder in 1965. Pilots disappeared into the jungle. Some ejected and were captured. Others were killed on impact or never found. The war consumed men and machines with mechanical efficiency, and the replacements kept coming. But the circumstances surrounding Falcon 1 and Falcon 2 had caught the attention of the wing intelligence officer, a lieutenant colonel named James Pruitt. Pruitt had flown B-29s over Japan in 1945 and had transitioned to intelligence work in the 1950s. He was methodical, skeptical, and deeply uncomfortable with unexplained variables. The radio transmission from Major Klein, "Something in the clouds," did not fit any known threat profile. It was not the language of a pilot taking fire. It was not the language of mechanical failure. It suggested something else entirely. Pruitt requested copies of all radio transcripts from search and rescue operations conducted on the 15th. He also requested weather data, radar tracks, and pilot debriefings from any aircraft operating in the Steel Tiger region that day. What he found disturbed him. 3 separate pilots, all flying different missions, all operating at different altitudes and times, had reported unusual cloud formations in the same general area where Falcon 1 and Falcon 2 had disappeared. The descriptions were consistent: dense, dark, static, unresponsive to wind. And in each case, the clouds had appeared rapidly, with no meteorological precursor. More troubling were the radio anomalies. Multiple aircraft had experienced communications failures while operating near these formations. The failures were temporary, lasting anywhere from 30 seconds to several minutes, and they affected both UHF and VHF frequencies simultaneously. Ground-based radar had also experienced intermittent loss of contact with aircraft transiting the area, though the aircraft themselves reported no equipment malfunctions. Pruitt brought his findings to the wing commander, Colonel David Shaw, on the morning of the 18th. Shaw listened, reviewed the data, and authorized a reconnaissance mission. An RF-4C Phantom, an unarmed photo reconnaissance variant, would overfly the Chapone area at high altitude and document any unusual weather phenomena. The mission would be flown solo, No weapons, maximum speed. If the clouds reappeared, the pilot was instructed to photograph them and return immediately. The mission launched at 1100 hours. Call sign Eyeball 21, piloted by Captain Raymond Fisher, a reconnaissance specialist with 2 tours in Southeast Asia. Fisher was accompanied by a weapons systems officer, Lieutenant David Knowles, who operated the cameras and navigation systems from the rear seat. The flight plan called for a high-altitude pass at 35,000 feet, well above the range of most anti-aircraft fire, with a photo run over the target area lasting approximately 4 minutes. At 11:34 hours, Fisher reported initial point and began his photo run. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, no clouds above 20,000 feet. Fisher activated the camera suite and began the systematic documentation of the terrain below. At 11:36 hours, the clouds appeared. Fisher's first transmission was calm, professional. Eyeball 21, observing rapid cloud formation, grid Yankee Delta 4732. Altitude appears 15 to 20,000 feet. Stand by. 30 seconds later, his tone changed. Eyeball 21, altitude now 30,000 and climbing. Formation is rising. Repeat, formation is rising. Lieutenant Knowles in the back seat began calling out altimeter readings. 25,000 feet, 28,000, 32,000. The cloud bank was not drifting upward on convective currents. It was ascending vertically, like smoke in a chimney, impossibly fast. At 11:37 hours, Fisher broke off the photo run and initiated a hard turn to the south, pushing the Phantom to full military power. The aircraft accelerated past Mach 1, the sonic boom rolling across the jungle below, but the clouds kept pace. Knowles reported that the formation was now level with them, a solid wall of gray stretching across the sky to their left. He said it looked like a storm front, but there was no lightning, no precipitation, no turbulence, just a smooth, vertical curtain of cloud that seemed to track their movement. Then the radio went dead. Ground control lost contact. No static, no interference, just silence. The radar track remained visible for another 40 seconds, showing the Phantom in a steep descent, heading south at high speed. Then the track disappeared. At Tan Son Nhut, the operations center went into immediate alert. Search and rescue was scrambled. Every available aircraft in the area was diverted to scan the last known position. And then, at 11:42 hours, 5 minutes after losing contact, Fisher's voice came back on the radio. He was breathing hard, speaking quickly. Eyeball 21 is clear. Repeat, we are clear. Emergency fuel state. Request immediate vector to nearest airfield. He was diverted to Nakhon Phanom Air Base in Thailand and landed 18 minutes later with less than 500 pounds of fuel remaining. When the ground crew reached the aircraft, they found Fisher and Knowles still strapped into their seats, helmets off, faces pale. Neither man spoke for several minutes. In the debriefing that followed, Fisher said the clouds had followed them, not drifted, not pursued by wind, followed. He said that when they broke through 20,000 feet in their descent, the formation had been directly above them, a ceiling of gray that blotted out the sun. He said he had pushed the throttles past max and dove for the deck, and only when they reached 5,000 feet did the clouds stop. Lieutenant Knowles said he had looked back during the descent. He said the cloud bank had contracted, pulling in on itself, collapsing into a single dense mass. And then it had dissipated, evaporating in seconds, leaving nothing but clear sky. When asked if they had captured any photographs, Knowles said the camera system had malfunctioned. All the film was blank. That evening, Captain Marsh was called into Colonel Shaw's office. Pruitt was there, along with the wing operations officer and 2 men in civilian clothes who were not introduced. Marsh was asked to provide his assessment of the meteorological data from the past week. He did. He told them the cloud formations were not natural. He told them the speed of formation, the altitude changes, and the lack of associated weather systems were inconsistent with any known atmospheric phenomenon. He told them that if he had not seen the data himself, he would have assumed it was fabricated. One of the civilians asked him what he thought it was, if not natural. Marsh said he did not know, but he said that whatever was happening over Laos, it was not weather. The meeting ended without conclusion. Marsh was instructed to continue monitoring and to report any further anomalies immediately. He was also told not to discuss his findings with anyone outside the room. 2 days later, another aircraft went missing. The third loss occurred during a night interdiction mission. Night operations over the Ho Chi Minh Trail were among the most dangerous assignments in the theater. Pilots flew without visual reference, relying on instruments and the faint glow of vehicle headlights or cooking fires to identify targets below. The North Vietnamese moved most of their supplies after dark, and the trail network came alive each evening with convoys of trucks grinding south through the mountain passes. The mission on the night of the 20th involved 4 F-4 Phantoms from the 497 Tactical Fighter Squadron, call signs Gunsmoke 1 through 4. They were tasked with a road interdiction patrol along Route 23, a supply artery that ran northeast from Chapone toward the Vietnamese border. The flight lead was Major Vincent Torre, a 32-year-old from Pittsburgh with over 150 combat missions. His wingmen were experienced, disciplined, and accustomed to the peculiar isolation of flying at night over hostile territory. The Phantoms launched at 20:30 hours and proceeded to their patrol area without incident. The night was moonless, the sky clear, the air smooth. At 21:05 hours, Torre reported contact with a convoy of vehicles moving south along Route 23. He rolled in for an attack run, descending through 10,000 feet, lining up on the headlights below. At 21:07 hours, his radio transmission changed. Gunsmoke 1, aborting. I have something on my scope. High altitude, no transponder, Gunsmoke flight, pull up. Pull up now. The wingmen responded immediately, breaking off their attack runs and climbing. Gunsmoke 2, Captain Louis Barnett, asked for clarification. Torre did not respond immediately. For nearly 15 seconds, the radio was silent except for the sound of Torre's breathing, audible over the open mic. Then Torre spoke again, his voice tight and controlled. Gunsmoke 1, I have visual on an object. Bearing 340, altitude approximately 25,000 feet. It's massive. Gunsmoke flight, stay clear. Do not approach. Gunsmoke 3, Lieutenant Marcus Day, asked what he was seeing. Torre said it was a cloud formation, but it was moving, not drifting. Moving deliberately, descending toward them. He said it was dark, almost black, and it was rotating. Captain Barnett confirmed visual contact. He said the formation looked like a thunderhead, but there was no lightning, no precipitation. He said it was shaped like a column, vertical, at least 10 miles across, and he said it was emitting light from within, a faint greenish glow that pulsed in irregular intervals. Lieutenant Day said he could see it now as well. He said it looked alive. At 21:09 hours, the sound began. It came through the radio first, a high-pitched tone, rising and falling in pitch, overlaying the pilot's transmissions. Ground control heard it. The other aircraft in the area heard it. It was not static. It was not interference. It was a sustained, modulating frequency that had no analog in any known communication system. Then the pilots began reporting they could hear it in their cockpits, not through the radios, through the airframes themselves. The sound was resonating through the metal, through the canopy glass, a vibration that climbed in intensity until it became painful. Torre ordered the flight to egress immediately. The 4 Phantoms turned south, afterburners lit, accelerating away from the formation. But the sound did not stop. It followed them. And as they descended through 15,000 feet, the cloud began to descend as well. Gunsmoke 4, the trail aircraft, piloted by First Lieutenant Aaron Grant, transmitted a final message at 21:11 hours. Gunsmoke 4, I'm inside it. I can't see. Instruments are spinning. I have no attitude reference. The transmission ended. Gunsmoke 4 disappeared from radar. The remaining 3 aircraft continued their egress, pushing their engines to maximum speed, diving for the deck. The sound intensified. Captain Barnett reported that his weapons systems officer, Lieutenant Edward Chin, was bleeding from the ears. Lieutenant Day said his canopy was vibrating so violently he thought it would shatter. At 21:13 hours, the sound stopped. The cloud formation was gone. Radar showed clear sky. The 3 Phantoms leveled off at 5,000 feet and conducted a systems check. All aircraft were functional. Lieutenant Chin was conscious but disoriented, complaining of severe headache and tinnitus. Gunsmoke 4 was never heard from again. Search and rescue operations began at first light. The area where the aircraft had disappeared was rugged, mountainous terrain covered in triple canopy jungle. No wreckage was located, no emergency beacons, no parachutes. First Lieutenant Aaron Grant and his weapons systems officer, Captain Roger Salinas, were listed as missing in action. The 3 surviving pilots were debriefed separately at Tan Son Nhut over the following 2 days. Their accounts were consistent. All 3 described the cloud formation in nearly identical terms. All 3 reported the sound, the vibration, the greenish glow, and all 3 insisted that the phenomenon was not natural. Major Torre, in his formal statement, said the cloud had demonstrated intentional behavior. He said it had tracked their movement, descended in response to their actions, and targeted the trail aircraft specifically. He said he had been flying combat missions for 2 years and had encountered thunderstorms, icing conditions, and every variety of adverse weather the region could produce. What he saw on the night of the 20th was not weather. Captain Barnett went further. He said the cloud was aware. He could not explain how he knew this, but he said he felt it. He said it had been watching them. Lieutenant Day refused to speculate. He said only that something had taken Gunsmoke 4 and that he did not want to fly over Laos again. The debriefs were classified immediately. The pilots were instructed not to discuss the incident with anyone outside the chain of command. And on the morning of the 22nd, Colonel Shaw convened an emergency meeting in the secure briefing room. Present were Captain Marsh, Lieutenant Colonel Pruitt, the wing operations officer, and the 2 unnamed civilians who had attended the previous meeting. Also present, via secure line from 7th Air Force Headquarters in Saigon, was a brigadier general whose name was not recorded in any official minutes. The general asked a single question: "Was this an enemy weapons system?" No one had an answer. Pruitt said that if it was a weapon, it was unlike anything the North Vietnamese or their Soviet advisors had deployed before. He said there were no known technologies that could produce the effects described by the pilots. Marsh said the meteorological data supported the possibility of artificial generation, but he had no framework for understanding how such a thing could be accomplished. One of the civilians, a thin man with gray hair who had remained silent during the previous meeting, said it was not a weapon. He said it was something else. When asked to elaborate, he declined. The general ended the meeting with a directive. All further flights over the Steel Tiger region were to avoid the area where the incidents had occurred. A 30-mile radius around Chapone was declared a no-fly zone for American aircraft, effective immediately. The losses would be attributed to enemy action. No mention of anomalous phenomena would appear in any official record, and if the clouds appeared again, no one was to engage. They were to turn away and report the sighting through classified channels only. The directive was implemented within hours. Pilots were briefed without explanation. The no-fly zone appeared on operational maps as a simple restricted area. no different from dozens of others scattered across the theater. But that night, as Captain Marsh sat alone in the meteorology office reviewing satellite imagery, he noticed something that made him go cold. The cloud formations had appeared in 3 locations over the past week: Chapone, Ban Laboy, and a third site, farther north, near the Plain of Jars. The 3 locations formed a perfect triangle, and at the center of that triangle was something that had not been there a month before. A storm system, stationary, unmoving, rotating slowly in a perfect spiral that covered an area 20 miles across. It had been there for 6 days, and it was growing. The decision to investigate the storm came from somewhere above the theater command structure. No formal orders were issued through normal channels. No mission briefs were logged in the standard operational records. On the morning of the 24th, Colonel Shaw received a classified message instructing him to provide aircraft and crew support for a reconnaissance operation to be conducted by personnel from an unnamed agency. The message specified that the mission would launch from Udorn, not Tan Son Nhut, and that no details were to be discussed outside the immediate chain of command. Udorn sat in northeastern Thailand, 40 miles south of the Laotian border. It was home to a mix of Air Force units and other organizations that operated without insignia or public acknowledgement. The base hosted reconnaissance aircraft, electronic warfare platforms, and various special operations elements that launched missions into Laos and North Vietnam under programs with names that changed regularly to avoid scrutiny. It was the kind of place where questions were not asked and manifest logs were kept deliberately vague. On the evening of the 24th, Major Torre and Captain Barnett were ordered to report to Udorn with their aircraft. No explanation was provided. They flew their Phantoms north that afternoon, landed, and were directed to a remote section of the flight line where ground crews immediately began modifying their aircraft. External fuel tanks were removed. Weapons pylons were stripped. In their place, technicians installed equipment neither pilot recognized, pod-shaped assemblies with multiple antennas and what appeared to be sensor arrays mounted in streamlined fairings. A civilian briefed them in a Quonset hut near the operations building. He was in his 40s, trim, with short-cropped hair and the bearing of someone who had spent time in uniform. He did not introduce himself. He said only that they would be flying an observation mission over the storm formation that Captain Marsh had identified. The mission would be conducted at high altitude, above 30,000 feet, with the objective of collecting electromagnetic and atmospheric data. They would not descend. They would not deviate from the flight plan. If they encountered anything unusual, they were to break off immediately and return to base. Torre asked what they were looking for. The civilian said they were trying to determine whether the storm was natural or artificial. Torre asked what kind of technology could create a stationary storm 20 miles across. The civilian said that was what they were trying to find out. The mission launched at 0600 hours on the 25th. 2 F-4 Phantoms, Torre in the lead, Barnett on his wing. They flew north across the Mekong River into Laos, climbing steadily, reaching altitude over the Plain of Jars as the sun broke above the eastern mountains. The sky was clear, visibility unlimited. Below them, the jungle stretched to the horizon, green and unbroken except for the faint scars of roads and bomb craters. At 0634 hours, Torre reported visual contact with the storm. It was exactly where the satellite imagery had placed it, a massive spiral of clouds centered over a stretch of karst mountains 30 miles northeast of the Plain of Jars. From altitude, it looked almost serene. The clouds rotated slowly, clockwise, like a hurricane viewed from above, but there was no eye. The center was not clear. It was filled with dense, dark cloud that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Torre and Barnett began their observation pass, flying a racetrack pattern around the perimeter of the formation at 35,000 feet. The sensor pods mounted on their aircraft hummed and clicked, recording data that neither pilot could interpret. The ride was smooth, no turbulence, no wind shear. The storm below appeared static, unchanging. At 0642 hours, the equipment in Torre's aircraft began registering anomalies. His weapons systems officer, Lieutenant Raymond Walsh, reported that the electromagnetic sensors were picking up energy emissions from the storm, not radio frequencies, not radar, something else. Walsh said the readings were off the scale, fluctuating wildly in bands that should not exist in natural atmospheric conditions. Barnett's back seat, Lieutenant Chin, the same officer who had been injured during the night mission on the 20th, reported similar readings. He said the emissions were intensifying as they completed each orbit, as if the storm were reacting to their presence. At 0645 hours, the storm began to change. The rotation accelerated. The clouds, which had been moving at a leisurely pace, suddenly spun faster, the spiral tightening, contracting inward. Torre called for Barnett to break off the pattern and move to a safe distance. Both Phantoms banked hard, accelerating away from the formation. But the storm followed. Not the entire mass. A tendril, a narrow, focused column of cloud, detached from the main body and extended toward them like a reaching arm. It moved impossibly fast, covering miles in seconds, climbing through the altitude bands without dispersing or losing cohesion. Torre pushed his throttles to full afterburner. The Phantom leapt forward, accelerating past Mach 1.5. Barnett stayed on his wing, both aircraft screaming south, vapor trails streaming behind them. The tendril pursued, extending, stretching across the sky. At 0647 hours, the sound began. It was the same high-pitched tone the pilots had reported on the night of the 20th, but louder, more intense. It resonated through the cockpits, through the airframes, a vibration that made the instruments blur and the canopy glass hum. Lieutenant Walsh shouted that the sensors were overloading, that they needed to shut down the equipment before it burned out. Torre ordered him to kill the pods. Walsh complied, flipping switches, cutting power to the sensor arrays. The moment the equipment went offline, the sound stopped. The tendril halted. It hung in the air behind them, a vertical column of cloud stretching from the main storm mass to their altitude, motionless. For several seconds, it remained there, suspended, as if watching them. Then it retracted. It pulled back into the main body of the storm, contracting as rapidly as it had extended, disappearing into the spiral. Within 30 seconds, the storm had returned to its original state. Slow rotation, stationary, unchanged. Torre and Barnett continued south without speaking. They did not level off until they were 50 miles from the storm, and they did not reduce speed until they crossed back into Thai airspace. They landed at Udorn at 0710 hours. Ground crews met them on the taxiway and immediately began removing the sensor pods. The civilian who had briefed them appeared within minutes, flanked by 2 technicians carrying equipment cases. He asked if the pods had functioned correctly. Torre said they had, until they overloaded. The civilian nodded and said the data would be analyzed. Torre asked what the hell they had just encountered. The civilian said he did not know yet, but he said the storm had demonstrated behavior consistent with active response to external stimulus. He said it was aware of their presence, and he said that based on the data, it had been there much longer than 6 days. When Torre asked how long, the civilian said the energy readings suggested the formation had been building for weeks, possibly months. It had simply been too small to detect until recently. And if the growth pattern continued at its current rate, it would cover an area of over 100 square miles within a month. Barnett asked what happened if it kept growing. The civilian did not answer. He simply walked away, carrying the sensor pods with him. That evening, Captain Marsh was summoned to Udorn. He was met by the same civilian and taken to a secure analysis room where technicians were reviewing the data from the morning's flight. Marsh was shown the recordings, electromagnetic signatures, atmospheric composition readings, energy density measurements. He studied them for over an hour in silence. When he finished, the civilian asked for his assessment. Marsh said the storm was not meteorological. He said the energy patterns resembled nothing in the atmospheric science literature. He said the formation was radiating power, not absorbing it, and that the source of that power was located at the center of the spiral. The civilian asked if it was a weapon. Marsh said he did not think so. He said it looked more like a breach. When asked what he meant, Marsh said the data suggested the storm was not an object in the atmosphere. It was an opening. Something was coming through. The decision to destroy the storm came swiftly and without debate. Whatever was happening over the karst mountains of Laos, it could not be allowed to continue. The formation was growing. Aircraft were disappearing, and the data collected by Torre and Barnett suggested that the phenomenon was accelerating towards some kind of threshold event that no one could predict or control. On the morning of the 27th, a strike package was assembled at Udorn. The mission would involve 8 F-4 Phantoms carrying a mixed load of high-explosive bombs, napalm canisters, and air-to-ground rockets. The objective was simple: saturate the center of the storm formation with ordnance and collapse whatever structure was sustaining it. The civilian overseeing the operation, now identified only as Mr. Carpenter, briefed the pilots personally. He told them the mission was voluntary. He told them the risks were unknown. And he told them that if they succeeded, there would be no public acknowledgement, no medals, no official record. Every pilot volunteered. The strike package launched at 0530 hours on the 28th. Major Torre led the formation with Captain Barnett on his wing. The remaining 6 aircraft were flown by pilots pulled from multiple squadrons, each with extensive combat experience. They flew north in 2 4-ship elements, climbing to altitude as they crossed into Laos, the sky still dark to the west, the first light of dawn breaking over the mountains to the east. At 0608 hours, they reached the initial point and began their approach to the target. The storm was larger. In the 3 days since Torre and Barnett had observed it, the formation had expanded by nearly 30%. The spiral now covered an area 26 miles in diameter, rotating faster than before, the clouds darker and denser. From altitude, it looked like a vast whirlpool carved into the sky, a wound in the atmosphere that pulsed with faint green light from within. Torre called the formation into attack configuration. The 8 Phantoms split into 2 groups, approaching the storm from opposite sides, planning to converge on the center simultaneously and release their ordnance in a single, coordinated strike. The theory was that overwhelming force, delivered all at once, might disrupt whatever process was sustaining the formation. At 0612 hours, Torre's element rolled in. They descended through 30,000 feet, accelerating, diving toward the center of the spiral. The ride was smooth initially, no turbulence, the air as calm as glass. But as they passed through 25,000 feet, the vibration began. It was subtle at first, a low hum that resonated through the airframes, building in intensity as they descended. At 20,000 feet, the sound arrived. The same high-pitched tone, rising and falling, but this time accompanied by a deeper frequency that Torre could feel in his chest, in his bones, as if the air itself were resonating. His weapons systems officer, Lieutenant Walsh, reported that the sensor equipment, reinstalled for the mission, was registering energy levels far beyond what they had recorded 3 days prior. At 15,000 feet, the clouds closed around them. The Phantoms entered the storm. Visibility dropped to 0. The world outside the canopy became a featureless gray void. No horizon, no reference, nothing but the instruments and the vibration that now shook the aircraft so violently Torre could barely read the gauges. He called for weapons release. All 4 aircraft in his element toggled their ordnance simultaneously. Bombs fell away. Napalm canisters tumbled downward. Rockets streaked into the gray. Nothing happened. No explosions, no flashes, no sound. The ordnance simply disappeared into the clouds below, swallowed by the formation as if it had never existed. Torre pulled up, climbing hard, trying to break back through the cloud ceiling. But the ceiling was gone. There was no top to the storm anymore. The gray extended upward as far as he could see, a vertical wall of cloud that had materialized around them. Barnett's voice came over the radio, calm but tense. "Lead, I've lost visual on you. I'm showing no altitude reference. Instruments are diverging." Torre checked his own instruments. The altimeter was spinning. The attitude indicator showed level flight, but he could feel the phantom banking. The compass was rotating slowly, as if the aircraft were turning, but the stick was centered. He tried to correct, but the controls felt sluggish, unresponsive. The second element, approaching from the opposite side, reported the same conditions. They had entered the storm and lost all spatial reference. One pilot, Captain Michael Denton, transmitted that his aircraft was inverted, but he could not tell which way was up. Another, Lieutenant Frank Osorio, said his engine instruments were showing conflicting readings, as if the aircraft were simultaneously climbing and descending. At 06:15 hours, the storm began to collapse. It did not dissipate gradually. It imploded. The clouds contracted inward with tremendous speed, pulling toward the center, compressing, tightening into a dense mass that glowed from within. The phantoms, caught inside the formation, were dragged inward with it. Torre felt the G-forces spike as his aircraft was pulled sideways, yawed hard to the right by an invisible force. He fought the controls, added power, tried to break free. The sound became a scream. It was no longer a tone. It was a roar, a shriek that filled the cockpit and made thought impossible. Lieutenant Walsh shouted something Torre could not hear. The canopy began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across the glass. The airframe groaned, metal bending under stress it was never designed to endure. And then, at 06:16 hours, the storm released them. The phantoms were ejected from the formation, flung outward like debris from an explosion. Torre's aircraft tumbled, spinning, out of control. He pulled the stick back, added right rudder, fought to stabilize. The gray void vanished. The sky reappeared, clear, bright, normal. His instruments snapped back to functional readings. Altitude 14,000 feet. Airspeed 420 knots. Wings level. He called for a status check. Barnett responded immediately, his aircraft intact, controllable. The remaining 6 Phantoms checked in one by one. All 8 aircraft had survived. Behind them, the storm was gone. Where the massive spiral had been, there was now only clear sky. No clouds, no trace of the formation. The karst mountains below were visible, green and unchanged, as if nothing had ever been there. Torre called for a damage assessment. Several aircraft reported cracked canopies, hydraulic leaks, and instrument malfunctions, but all were flyable. He ordered the formation to return to Udorn immediately. They landed 40 minutes later. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, documenting the damage, photographing the stress fractures in the airframes. Mr. Carpenter met Torre on the flight line and asked for an immediate debrief. Torre told him the ordnance had no effect. He told him the storm had collapsed on its own, as if it had completed whatever process it had been conducting. He told him that for approximately 90 seconds, his aircraft had been inside something that was not weather, not atmosphere, not anything he had words to describe. Carpenter listened without interrupting. Then he asked if Torre thought it was over. Torre said he did not know. He said the storm was gone, but he did not think they had destroyed it. He thought it had simply finished. When asked what that meant, Torre said he thought it had opened, and whatever it was supposed to let through had come through. Carpenter dismissed him without comment. But that evening, reconnaissance flights were launched over the entire region where the storm had been. They found no wreckage, no debris, no evidence of the 8 aircraft that had disappeared over the past 2 weeks. They also found no enemy activity, no troop movements, nothing unusual, except for one thing. In the center of the area where the storm had been, in a clearing on the side of a karst mountain, the infrared cameras detected a heat signature. It was small, roughly 6 feet across, circular, and radiating a temperature of over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. It remained there for 3 days. Then it vanished. No explanation was ever provided. The no-fly zone over northeastern Laos remained in effect through the end of March. Pilots were told the area was saturated with anti-aircraft defenses and that losses had been deemed unacceptable. Missions were rerouted. Target lists were revised. The war continued without pause, and within days the focus had shifted to other sectors, other operations, other crises that demanded immediate attention. But the pilots who had been involved, Torre, Barnett, Fisher, and the others, did not forget. They flew their assigned missions, returned to their squadrons, and resumed the rhythm of combat operations. But something had changed. They were quieter, more cautious, and they watched the sky differently now, scanning the clouds with an intensity that had nothing to do with weather or enemy aircraft. Captain Marsh remained at Tan Son Nhut, monitoring meteorological data from across the theater. He filed his reports, briefed the weather forecasts, and continued his duties without incident. But each night, alone in the meteorology office, he reviewed satellite imagery of the area where the storm had been. He searched for any indication that the phenomenon might return. He found nothing. The skies over Laos remained clear. On the morning of the 2nd, Marsh received a message instructing him to report to the visiting officer's quarters. When he arrived, he was met by Mr. Carpenter, the civilian who had overseen the strike mission. Carpenter was alone, standing near the window, looking out across the flight line where Phantoms were taxiing for the morning launch. Carpenter asked Marsh if he had detected any further anomalies. Marsh said he had not. The atmospheric conditions in the region had returned to normal. There were no unusual cloud formations, no electromagnetic signatures, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. Carpenter nodded. Then he asked Marsh what he thought had happened. Marsh hesitated. Then he said he thought the storm had been a threshold event, a point where atmospheric conditions, energy dynamics, and something else had converged to create an opening. He said he thought the opening had been temporary, that it had remained stable only as long as the conditions were sustained, and that when those conditions collapsed, the opening had closed. Carpenter asked what had come through. Marsh said he did not know. He said the data suggested energy transfer, but he had no way to measure or quantify what that meant. He said that if something had emerged from the storm, it had left no trace he could detect. Carpenter told him the investigation was being closed. The incidents would be classified, the records sealed, and all personnel involved would be instructed to sign non-disclosure agreements. The official explanation for the aircraft losses would remain enemy action. No further inquiry would be conducted. Marsh asked why. Carpenter said because there were no answers. He said they had collected data, documented the phenomenon, and attempted to understand it. But they had failed. And without understanding, without a framework for explaining what had occurred, there was no value in continued investigation. The war would not pause for mysteries. Resources would not be diverted to study something that might never happen again. Marsh accepted this without argument. But before Carpenter left, Marsh asked him one final question. He asked if Carpenter believed the storm was unique, or if he thought it might happen elsewhere. Carpenter was silent for a long moment. Then he said that similar reports had been filed from other theaters over the past decade: Korea, the Baltic, the Mediterranean. always the same pattern: rapid cloud formation, electromagnetic anomalies, aircraft disappearances, always dismissed as weather, as instrument failure, as pilot error. He said that until someone developed a theory that could explain the phenomenon, it would continue to be dismissed. Marsh asked if anyone was working on such a theory. Carpenter said there were individuals in various agencies who collected the reports, cataloged them, and attempted to find patterns, but the work was informal, underfunded, and not sanctioned by any official program. He said that if Marsh wanted to contribute, he could submit his findings through classified channels, and they would be added to the archive. Marsh said he would. Carpenter thanked him and left. 3 days later, Marsh received orders transferring him to a meteorological research unit at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. The transfer was effective immediately. He packed his files, boxed his notes, and departed Tan Son Nhut on the 7th of April. He never returned to Vietnam. Major Torre completed his tour in June 1967 and returned to the United States. He was reassigned to a training squadron at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, where he spent the next 2 years instructing young pilots in the fundamentals of air combat. He did not speak publicly about the events over Laos. When asked by fellow officers, he said only that he had lost friends, flown difficult missions, and seen things he could not explain. In 1970, Torre retired from the Air Force and moved to Colorado, where he worked as a commercial pilot for a regional airline. He kept a journal, recording his memories of the war in careful detail, including the events of March 1967. The journal remained in his possession until his death in 2003. It was never published. Captain Barnett remained in the Air Force and rose to the rank of colonel. He served in multiple theaters, commanded a fighter wing, and retired in 1988. In his later years, he occasionally gave interviews about his experiences in Vietnam, but he never mentioned the storm. When pressed by researchers who had uncovered fragments of the story, he said only that some things were better left classified. Lieutenant Walsh, Torre's weapons systems officer during the strike mission, left the Air Force in 1968 and entered academia. He earned a doctorate in physics and spent 30 years teaching at a university in the Midwest. In the 1990s, he began corresponding with researchers interested in unexplained aerial phenomena. He shared some of his recollections, but he never released any documentation. He said the data had been confiscated and that he had no access to it. The heat signature detected in the clearing on the Karst Mountain was investigated by a ground team in early April 1967. The team consisted of Air Force Special Operations personnel and 2 civilian scientists whose names were redacted from all reports. They reached the site after a 3-day overland trek through jungle terrain and found a circular depression in the ground, approximately 6 feet in diameter and 3 feet deep. The soil within the depression was fused, glass-like, as if exposed to extreme heat. Radiation levels were elevated, but not dangerous. No organic material remained within the affected area. Samples were collected and transported to a laboratory in Thailand. Analysis revealed unusual isotopic signatures that did not match any known geological or artificial source. Further testing was inconclusive. The samples were shipped to the United States for additional study, but no findings were ever published. The depression remained visible for several weeks. Then during the monsoon season, it filled with water and vegetation began to reclaim the site. By the end of 1967, the clearing showed no evidence of disturbance. The war in Vietnam continued for another 8 years. Thousands more aircraft flew over Laos. Hundreds more pilots were lost, but no further incidents matching the pattern of March 1967 were ever reported, at least not officially. The declassification of Vietnam War documents began in the late 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s as the political sensitivity surrounding the conflict diminished and the Freedom of Information Act mandated the release of historical records. Millions of pages were processed, redacted, and made available to researchers, historians, and the general public. Most documented the routine bureaucracy of war, logistics reports, personnel rosters, operational summaries. But buried within the archives were fragments of incidents that had been deliberately obscured, filed under vague headings, and scattered across multiple record groups to prevent comprehensive review. In November 1994, a researcher named Dr. Ellen Forrester was conducting a survey of Air Force accident investigation files from the Vietnam era when she encountered a reference that caught her attention. It appeared in a casualty report dated March 1967, listing the loss of 2 F-4 Phantoms from the 433rd Tactical Fighter Squadron. The report attributed the losses to enemy action, but a marginal note, handwritten and barely legible, read, "See Met. ANOM file, restricted access." Forrester requested the meteorological anomaly file. The request was denied. She submitted a formal FOIA petition. 6 months later, she received a partial response. The file had been declassified, but heavily redacted. Of the original 63 pages, only 18 were released. The remainder were withheld under exemptions related to national security and ongoing intelligence activities. The released pages contained fragments of Captain Marsh's meteorological reports, excerpts from pilot debriefing transcripts, and a single photograph, the image taken at Montreuil-aux-Lyons in September 1914. The photograph showed a dirt road, a stone wall, and a body, but the drum that had been visible in the original image had been cropped out. Forrester noted the inconsistency. She also noted that the meteorological reports referenced a phenomenon over Laos in March 1967, but provided no details. The pilot transcripts were even more cryptic, containing statements like formation demonstrated non-standard behavior and energy signatures inconsistent with known parameters, but offering no context or explanation. She expanded her search. Over the next 2 years, she combed through related record groups, cross-referencing unit histories, personnel files, and intelligence summaries. She found additional references, brief mentions of unusual weather patterns, electromagnetic anomalies, and aircraft losses attributed to unknown causes. The incidents spanned decades. Korea, 1952, the Baltic Sea, 1961, the Mediterranean, 1965, Vietnam, 1967. Always the same pattern, always classified, always incomplete. In 1996, Forrester published a paper in a military history journal outlining her findings. The paper was titled Anomalous Atmospheric Phenomena in Combat Zones, a pattern analysis of declassified incident reports, 1950 to 1970. It documented 17 separate incidents across multiple theaters, all involving rapid cloud formation, electromagnetic interference, and unexplained aircraft losses. Forrester argued that the incidents represented a category of atmospheric event that had not been adequately studied or understood by meteorological science. The paper attracted little attention. Most historians dismissed it as speculative. The few scientists who reviewed it noted that the evidence was fragmentary and that without access to the full classified records, no meaningful analysis could be conducted. But the paper did reach one reader who recognized its significance. In early 1997, Forrester received a letter from a retired Air Force officer living in Colorado. The officer did not identify himself by name, but he provided enough detail in the letter to make clear he had been involved in one of the incidents Forrester had documented. He said her paper had brought back memories he had spent 30 years trying to forget. He said the phenomenon she described was real, that he had witnessed it firsthand, and that the official explanations were deliberately false. He also said that the phenomenon had not stopped. He said that over the years, he had maintained informal contact with other pilots who had experienced similar events. He said the incidents continued to occur, though rarely, and always in remote areas, where they could be easily dismissed or suppressed. He said that no government agency had conducted a serious investigation and that the data collected during his own encounter had been confiscated and never returned. The letter concluded with a warning. He told Forrester to be careful. He said that inquiries into these matters attracted attention from individuals who preferred the incidents remain obscure. He said he had been visited twice over the years by men who identified themselves as federal agents but provided no credentials. They had asked him not to discuss what he had seen. He had complied, but he wanted her to know the truth, even if it could never be proven. Forrester never received another communication from the officer. She attempted to identify him through research, cross-referencing names from declassified personnel files, but the records were too incomplete. If he had been involved in the March 1967 incidents, his name had been redacted from every document she could access. She continued her research for several more years, submitting additional FOIA requests, contacting veterans organizations, and interviewing former pilots who had served in Southeast Asia. A few acknowledged hearing rumors of unusual incidents, but none would speak on the record. Most denied any knowledge. Several told her bluntly to stop asking questions. In 2001, Forrester published a book based on her research. The book, titled The Screaming Sky: Unexplained Phenomena in Modern Warfare, compiled the available evidence and presented the incidents as case studies in the intersection of military operations and atmospheric science. The book was published by a small academic press and sold fewer than 2,000 copies. It received no mainstream reviews, but the book did reach a wider audience through online communities interested in unexplained phenomena. Enthusiasts debated the cases, speculated about causes, and proposed theories ranging from secret weapons to extraterrestrial activity. Forrester distanced herself from these interpretations. She insisted the incidents were atmospheric in nature, that they represented gaps in scientific understanding rather than evidence of anything supernatural or conspiratorial. In 2008, Forrester received a package in the mail. It contained no return address. Inside was a manila folder with a single document, a declassified memo dated 28 March 1919 from a British War Office officer discussing the suppression of reports related to unexplained phenomena during the First World War. The memo mentioned a drumbeat heard by soldiers during the retreat from Mons and recommended the reports be withheld from the official history. Attached to the memo was a handwritten note. It read, "They've been covering this up for 100 years. Good luck." Forrester never determined who sent the package, but she included the memo in a revised edition of her book, published in 2010. The revised edition added a new chapter connecting the incidents she had documented to earlier historical cases, arguing that the phenomenon was not limited to the modern era but had been occurring for centuries. The revised edition sold even fewer copies than the original. Dr. Ellen Forrester retired from academia in 2015 and moved to Vermont. She continued to maintain a private archive of documents related to her research, but she conducted no further active investigation. In interviews, she said she had done what she could. The evidence existed, the pattern was clear, but without access to the full classified record, no definitive conclusions could be reached. In 2019, a researcher working in the National Archives discovered an additional file related to the March 1967 incidents. The file had been misfiled in a collection of meteorological data from the Pacific Theater and had not been cataloged correctly. It contained Captain Marsh's complete field notes, including detailed observations of the storm formation, the energy readings collected during the reconnaissance flights, and his final assessment, the one he had given to Mr. Carpenter on the 2nd of April 1967. Marsh had written, "The phenomenon observed over Laos in March 1967 was not meteorological. It was a threshold event, a temporary convergence of conditions that allowed for energy transfer between distinct atmospheric layers, or potentially between discrete spatial domains. The storm was not a weather system. It was an aperture. What emerged from that aperture, if anything, remains unknown, but the mechanism that generated it is likely repeatable under the correct conditions. It is my recommendation that further study be conducted to identify those conditions and to develop countermeasures. Absent such study, we will remain vulnerable to recurrence. The file was declassified in full and added to the public archive in 2020. By then, Dr. Forrester was 81 years old. When informed of the discovery, she said only that she was glad the record was finally complete. The file sits in the archive today, available to any researcher who requests it. It has been accessed fewer than a dozen times. And in the restricted sections of the archive, in files still classified, still withheld, still marked with codes that prevent their release, there are additional reports. Incidents from the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. Each following the same pattern, each dismissed, explained away, or attributed to more prosaic causes. The phenomenon has not stopped. It is simply no longer discussed. And somewhere, in a clearing on a karst mountain in Laos, beneath the jungle canopy, the ground remains fused and glass-like. The vegetation has reclaimed it. The monsoons have eroded it. But the isotopic signature remains, detectable by instruments sensitive enough to measure it. The aperture opened once. The data suggests it could open again. No one is watching for it.